I used to believe that my life was a curse. I grew up in the kind of place where people like me were invisible, ignored, and underestimated. They called it the trailer park. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't glamorous. It was just a row of mobile homes on a dirt road with broken down cars and weeds growing through the cracks. The air always smelled like wet grass and gasoline. And the sound of tires crunching on gravel was the soundtrack of my childhood. People who lived in the trailers didn't get invited to parties. They didn't get asked to the prom. They didn't get to be part of the good crowd. We were just the other, the ones who cleaned up after everyone else. But no one ever asked what happened when we weren't cleaning. My name is Ava Jenkins, and this is the story of how I went from being called trailer trash to owning everything they once said I couldn't. I remember the first time someone called me trash. I was 8 years old, standing at the bus stop, clutching my backpack tightly as the other kids laughed. There was a group of boys, all in their brand new sneakers, talking about how their parents bought them everything they wanted. They had the latest phones, the newest video games, and their clothes always looked fresh. I had none of that. I had hand-me-downs, secondhand shoes, and a backpack that was barely holding together. One of the boys, Timmy Harris, looked me up and down, sneering as he spoke. "You're just trash," he said. "Your mom is trash. Your whole family is trash." And the others laughed. Laughed like it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. At the time, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fight back, how to explain that just because we didn't have a big house, it didn't mean we were trash. But I knew it hurt. I knew it hurt because it wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that. It was just the first time someone had said it to my face. Growing up in the trailer park, I learned to keep my head down and keep my mouth shut. We were always on the outside, always looking in at the shiny, perfect lives of the people who lived in the big houses on the hill. They had everything. They had power. They had respect. And we had nothing. But we had each other. My mom worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. She was a waitress at a local diner and cleaned offices at night. She worked herself to the bone, but it was never enough. It never felt like enough. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes when she came home late, dragging her feet, too tired to even eat. I hated seeing her like that, but she never complained, not once. She'd always tell me, "One day, baby, we're gonna make it out of here. You just keep your head high." I didn't believe her. I wanted to believe her, but I didn't know how that could ever happen. How could someone like us, with nothing, ever get out of a place like this? In school, I was the quiet one. I didn't talk much. I didn't have the energy to argue with the kids who thought they were better than me. I stayed in my lane. I studied hard, even when the textbooks were outdated, even when the teachers didn't care enough to give us the resources we needed. I made the honor roll every year, but it didn't matter. To them, I was still trash. Still the girl from the trailer park. I tried to ignore it. I tried to pretend it didn't bother me. But every day, it was like a little piece of me was chipping away. The whispers in the hallways, the laughter behind my back, the looks when I walked into class knowing that they all knew who I was and where I came from. But I wasn't stupid. I knew how the world worked. If you were poor, you didn't matter. If you were black and poor, you really didn't matter. It wasn't until I was 16 that things started to change. It was the summer before my senior year of high school, and I was working at a local fast food restaurant, flipping burgers and cleaning trays. It wasn't glamorous, but it was money, and it was something to do while everyone else was out having fun. But one day, something happened that would change my life forever. A man walked into the restaurant. He was wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, and he looked out of place in the greasy fast food joint. He ordered his meal, and I took it to his table. He smiled at me. "You have a lot of potential," he said, his voice low and smooth. I didn't know what he meant. "I'm just working here," I said. "No," he replied. "You're a smart girl, I can tell. I think you can do better than this." At first, I thought he was just being polite, but he wasn't. He came back the next day and the day after that. And finally, after weeks of seeing him, he made me an offer. "I know someone who could help you with college applications. You're smart enough to go places. Let me help." That man changed everything. His name was Robert Miller, a local business owner who had grown up in a similar neighborhood. He had been the kid no one believed in, and now he was a successful.
The first time I walked into the town hall as a business owner, It felt surreal. People who once looked at me with pity or disgust now had to look up to me. They had to listen. They had to respect me. But not everyone was happy about it. I remember the looks on their faces when I introduced myself as the new owner of half the town's businesses. There was a man, Bill Johnson, who had always been the mayor's right-hand man, a local businessman who owned the biggest hardware store in town. He had been the one to give my family dirty looks when we went into his shop, the one to make rude comments under his breath when we passed by. Now, he was standing in front of me, shaking my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Welcome to the club," he said, but I could see the thinly veiled disdain behind his words. Bill Johnson had never been a fan of people like me, people who came from nothing and managed to do something with it. "You have a lot of work ahead of you," he said, looking around the town hall. "The town's in bad shape. It's going to take more than money to fix it." I smiled. "I'm not here to fix the town. I'm here to make it thrive. And I don't need your permission to do that." He blinked. "We'll see." I knew then that this wasn't going to be easy. There would be resistance. People like Bill Johnson didn't want change. They didn't want someone like me coming in and shaking things up. They wanted things to stay the way they were, comfortable, predictable, and safe for them. But they didn't realize that change was inevitable. It was already happening. And I was at the forefront of it. Over the next few months, I worked tirelessly. I didn't just buy up buildings and properties. I brought new ideas to the table. I started local programs to help small businesses get off the ground. I invested in schools, giving scholarships to students who had the potential but not the resources. I hired people from the very communities that had once been neglected. I gave them jobs, opportunities, and hope. I wasn't just changing the physical landscape of the town, I was changing its soul. But with progress came pushback. I wasn't naive. I knew that not everyone would appreciate what I was doing. Bill Johnson and his cronies were still around, whispering behind closed doors, trying to undermine everything I built. But I had something they didn't: the support of the people. The people who had once been forgotten, who had been overlooked and abandoned, now had a voice, and they were ready to fight for what was theirs. One afternoon, as I was meeting with a group of local business owners in the newly renovated coffee shop I had invested in, I overheard a conversation outside. It was Bill Johnson and a few other prominent townsfolk. They were talking about me, about how I was ruining the town and taking over. I didn't make myself known at first. I just listened. "I don't like the way she's doing business," Bill Johnson said. "She's too aggressive, too determined. She's going to tear this town apart if we don't stop her." "You think we can stop her?" another voice asked. "I don't know, but we need to try." At that moment, I knew something had to change. I couldn't just be the businesswoman who renovated buildings. I had to become the force they feared. I had to become the person who controlled not just the economy, but the direction of the town. I needed to make sure my presence was felt in every corner of the town, in every conversation, in every deal, in every decision. And to do that, I had to take a more direct approach. It was time to run for mayor. At first, I laughed at the idea. Me? Running for mayor? It seemed impossible. I had no political experience. I wasn't one of the good old boys who had been in power for decades. But then I realized that was exactly why I needed to do it. I wasn't part of the system that had kept people like me down. I wasn't a part of the club that decided who mattered and who didn't. I was something new, and the town needed something new. So I gathered my team, organized a campaign, and hit the streets. I knocked on doors, spoke to anyone who would listen, and made my case. I wasn't running to be a politician. I was running to be a leader who would work for the people, not for the powerful few. A leader who would make this town thrive for everyone, not just those who had been in control for too long. The more I spoke, the more I realized how much I had underestimated the power of my own voice. People were listening. People were seeing me in a way they hadn't before. And I wasn't going to let that opportunity slip away. But, of course, there were challenges. The town's old guard wasn't going to give up without a fight. They launched smear campaigns, spread rumors about me, and tried to discredit everything I had done. They tried to paint me as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong. But the more they fought, the more determined I became. I wasn't going to back down. I had come too far. I had built too much. And now I was going to take control. Election day came, and the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The tension was palpable. I walked into the polling station, my heart pounding, but my head held high. I had done everything I could. Now, all I had to do was wait. When the results came in, I could hardly believe it. I had won. I had won by a landslide. The people had spoken. They wanted change. They wanted someone who would fight for them. And they had chosen me. As I stood there, holding the mayoral certificate in my hands, I thought back to that day when Timmy Harris had called me trash. To all the people who had looked down on me, who had said I would never make anything of myself, to everyone who had doubted me. I had proved them wrong. I wasn't trash. I wasn't a nobody. I was someone who had built something from nothing. And now, I was the mayor of this town. Being elected mayor was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Suddenly, I wasn't just the businesswoman who'd turned the town around. I was now responsible for every person who lived here. Every decision I made would affect the future of the people who had supported me and the ones who hadn't. But I wasn't afraid. This was what I'd been working for my entire life. The challenge wasn't new to me. It was just the next step in proving everyone wrong. The first thing I did as mayor was clear. I focused on what mattered most, the people. I allocated funds to fix the infrastructure. I started by repairing roads that had been neglected for decades, fixing streetlights, and providing funding for public services that had been left to crumble. I wanted to show the people that I wasn't just another politician who would make empty promises. I wanted to make real, tangible change that everyone could see and feel. But the old guard wasn't happy. They never are. Bill Johnson and his allies in the town council did everything they could to undermine my authority. They tried to block every decision I made, to twist the narrative and make me look like an outsider. They made my life difficult, but I refused to back down. I was here for the people, and no one was going to stop me from delivering on my promises. The first real test came when the town's water supply was contaminated. It was a crisis. People were scared. I knew I had to act fast. The old town leadership had let the water system fall into disrepair for years, but now it was my responsibility to fix it. I called an emergency town meeting, and for the first time I saw the full weight of the community behind me. People showed up, not just to complain, but to offer solutions. They were tired of waiting for someone else to fix things. They wanted to be part of the change. I called for an emergency funding plan to fix the water system. I set up a temporary water distribution system, working with local businesses to provide bottled water. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't cheap, but I knew it was the right thing to do. The people were counting on me. I couldn't let them down. At the same time, Bill Johnson and the others tried to discredit me. They spread rumors that I was only interested in making money off the crisis. They tried to claim I was using the town's misfortune to line my pockets, but the people knew the truth. They saw the work I was putting in, the sleepless nights, the endless meetings. They knew I was doing everything I could to make this town better. I won't lie. It was exhausting. There were times when I wondered if it was worth it, if the constant fight was draining me too much. But then I'd see someone from the community, someone who had nothing, standing up and fighting alongside me. It reminded me why I was doing this. It reminded me of the little girl who had been called trash, the girl who had been told she wasn't good enough, the girl who had promised herself she would never give up. As the months passed, I began to see the changes I had hoped for. The town started to thrive again. Businesses that had once been on the brink of closing were now booming. Schools that had been underfunded and neglected were finally receiving the attention they deserved. Crime rates dropped, and people started to feel safe again. There was a sense of pride in the town, something that had been missing for so long. But not everyone was happy. Bill Johnson, who had once been the king of this town, wasn't about to let go of his power so easily. He started to spread lies about me, claiming I was mismanaging the town's finances, that I was corrupt. He even tried to get other council members to vote me out of office. But this time, I had the support of the people, the ones who had been with me from the start, the ones who knew the truth. And then, something happened that I wasn't expecting. One day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Bill Johnson's company, and it was an offer. He wanted to buy out my business. He wanted to buy everything I had built. He thought that if he could take away my wealth, he could take away my power. He thought that if he could force me to sell, I'd have to walk away. The letter was filled with insults and threats, but it also came with a large sum of money. It was an offer I couldn't refuse, he said. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. I laughed as I read the letter. He thought he could intimidate me. He thought that I would just give up everything I had worked for. But he didn't know what I had become. He didn't know how far I had come. I called a meeting with my team that afternoon. I told them what had happened. They were shocked, but they were also ready to fight. They knew what we had built together. They knew that we weren't going to let someone like Bill Johnson take it away. I made a decision right then and there. I wasn't going to sell. I wasn't going to back down. I was going to buy him out instead. That night, I sat in my office, staring out the window at the town I had worked so hard to rebuild. I thought about everything that had happened, the struggles, the setbacks, the endless battles. But I also thought about the people who had stood by me, the ones who had believed in me when no one else would. They were the reason I kept going. They were the reason I couldn't quit. I picked up the phone and called my financial advisor. "I want to make an offer," I said. "I want to buy Bill Johnson's company." He was shocked. "Are you sure? You know what you're getting into, right?" "I'm sure," I replied. "Let's do it." Over the next few weeks, I worked with my team to put together the deal. It wasn't easy. Bill Johnson fought tooth and nail to hold on to his empire, but I was determined. I had the resources, I had the drive, and I wasn't going to let him stand in my way. Finally, the day came when the deal was sealed. I had bought him out. I had taken his company, his power, and his influence. And when the papers were signed, I made one last call. "Bill," I said, my voice steady, "I just wanted to let you know that I bought everything you own, every last bit of it. I hope you enjoyed your time at the top." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, finally, he spoke. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice filled with anger. "I won't," I replied. "And I never will." The day after I took ownership of Bill Johnson's company, something inside me changed. It wasn't just the satisfaction of defeating an old enemy. It wasn't the financial power that now rested in my hands. It was the realization that I had finally taken control, not just of the town, but of my own life. Every obstacle, every challenge, every setback had led me here. And now, nothing could stop me. The first thing I did was make sure the people who had stood by me received their fair share of the victory. I'd spent so many years being told I was nothing. I'd spent so many years working for others, scraping by. But now, I wasn't just a business owner. I was the symbol of everything they had always said we couldn't be. I called the people who worked for me, the ones who had supported me in my rise, and I made sure they knew how important they were to this victory. I gave bonuses to the employees who had been with me from the start. I increased their salaries. I told them that this wasn't just my success, it was ours. I also used my new position to push for reforms that would directly benefit the town's most vulnerable. The first thing on my list was health care. The people in this town had never had proper health care. The only options were overpriced clinics that didn't care, or waiting hours for emergency room visits. That had to change. I started working on a proposal for a community health initiative, one that would provide free or affordable care for everyone, regardless of their income. The town was starting to thrive again. Businesses were growing. New families were moving in. But the most important thing wasn't the money or the development. It was the change in the people's mentality. They were beginning to believe in themselves again. They were starting to realize that they didn't have to settle for less. They didn't have to accept being trash or nobodies anymore. But even with all the progress, there was still one thing that haunted me. One person who refused to accept that I had won. And that person was Bill Johnson. Bill didn't take defeat lightly. The day after I bought his company, he disappeared. No calls, no emails, no social media posts. He simply vanished from the public eye. But I knew he wouldn't stay down for long. He was too proud, too angry, and he had too many connections. It wasn't long before I heard whispers. There were rumors that he was planning something. People said he was trying to rally the old guard, the people who had once controlled this town, and that he was working with outside investors to take the town back. They wanted to take the land I had worked so hard to acquire, to turn it into something profitable. They didn't care about the people. They cared about the money. I knew I had to act quickly. I couldn't let him take everything I had built. I couldn't let him destroy the progress we had made. But I also knew that I couldn't do it alone. I needed my team. I needed the people who had helped me get this far. So I did what I had always done. I called a meeting. I called everyone who believed in the town, who believed in what we were doing, to gather and strategize. We couldn't let Bill Johnson take us down again. But this time, it wasn't just about business. It was about community. It was about showing Bill and anyone else who tried to tear us apart that this wasn't just my victory. It was the victory of everyone who had been pushed down for too long. It was the victory of the people who had been told they would never amount to anything. The plan was simple. We had to make it clear that the town belonged to its people, and that no one, no matter how powerful, could take that away. The night we launched our counterattack, I stood in the center of the town square, looking at the people who had become my family. They were there, supporting me, supporting us. and I knew that I was ready to fight. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to let Bill Johnson and his wealthy friends destroy everything we had worked for. This was my town. This was our town. We held a rally, and the message was clear. The town was ours. It wasn't up for sale. It wasn't going anywhere. And anyone who tried to take it would have to answer to the people. The turnout was overwhelming. People came from every corner of the town. The streets were packed. I saw faces I had never seen before. Faces of people who had once been afraid to speak up, afraid to stand out, but who now believed they had a voice. They believed they had power, and they were ready to fight for it. Bill Johnson didn't show up that night, but his presence was felt. There were whispers that he was in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. But I wasn't afraid. We had built something stronger than his money, stronger than his connections. We had built a community that wasn't going to let anyone tear it apart. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The pressure was on. Bill Johnson tried every trick in the book to discredit me, to stir up division, but it didn't work. The people were too united. They knew who was fighting for them, and they knew who was trying to tear them down. And then, just when I thought it was over, the final blow came. Bill Johnson filed a lawsuit. He claimed that I had taken over the town illegally, that I had forced people out of their homes and used my power to intimidate the town council into giving me control. It was a desperate move, one that had no real basis, but it was enough to stir up doubt, enough to get people talking, enough to try to tear apart the trust I had built. But this time, I wasn't alone. I had a team of lawyers who believed in me. I had the community backing me. I had the support of the very people who had helped me build everything. And I was ready to fight. I was ready to prove, once and for all, that this town was mine, that I wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The courtroom battle was intense. Bill Johnson's lawsuit against me was nothing more than a last-ditch attempt to reclaim the power he had lost. He had money. He had influence. But I had something much more powerful: the truth. The trial lasted for weeks. Every day, I walked into that courtroom with my head held high, knowing that I was fighting not just for myself, but for every person in this town who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, and discarded. The people who had been called trash their entire lives. The people who had never had a chance, but who were now standing with me. They were my strength. They were the reason I couldn't lose. Bill's lawyers tried everything. They claimed I had used underhanded tactics to force people out of their homes. They tried to paint me as a greedy opportunist, someone who only cared about money. But I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for something much bigger than that. I was fighting for a legacy that would prove to the world that people like me, people from the trailer parks, people who had been told they would never amount to anything, could rise up and change everything. I wasn't fighting for the victory. I was fighting for the people who had believed in me, for the ones who had stuck by my side through every obstacle, every challenge. I was fighting for them to have a future where they could dream, a future where they weren't stuck in a cycle of poverty and shame. The final day of the trial came. The air was thick with tension. The courtroom was packed. Reporters were buzzing outside, waiting for the verdict. Bill Johnson was sitting in the front row, his face twisted with frustration. He had lost his grip on the town, and he knew it. I stood before the judge, my lawyer beside me. The judge listened carefully to both sides, weighing the evidence, and then, finally, he spoke. "I find in favor of the defendant," he said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "The plaintiff's claims are without merit. The town of Pine Ridge belongs to its people, and no one, not even someone with the financial power to try and take it, can take that away." The moment those words left his mouth, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had won. It was over. Bill Johnson had lost. And in the process, I had proved that no matter where you came from, no matter what they called you had the power to change your own destiny. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace, the fight was over. The battle had been won, not by money, not by influence, but by the belief in something greater. I had fought for the people, and together we had won. As I stepped outside, the crowd that had gathered cheered. They weren't cheering for me, they were cheering for themselves, for their own victory, for the victory of the people who had been counted out, but who had refused to stay down. I looked around at the faces of the people who had come to support me, and I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. We had done something that no one thought was possible. We had taken back control. And now the future was ours. The town had changed. It was no longer the place where people were forgotten. It was no longer a place where the rich and powerful got to make the rules. It was a place where everyone had a voice, where everyone had a chance. And that, to me, was the greatest victory of all. A few weeks later, I stood at the corner of the town square, looking out at the vibrant community that had once been on the brink of destruction. The streets were busy. People were laughing. Children played in the park. The businesses that had been abandoned were now thriving. And there, at the heart of it all, was the town hall, my office, my place of work, the symbol of everything I had built. Bill Johnson was long gone. The town had moved on, and I had finally found the peace I had been searching for. But I wasn't finished. There was still so much to be done. There were still people to help, still dreams to build. As I walked into the town hall, I thought back to the days when I had been called trash, when people had looked at me and written me off, when I had believed that I would never amount to anything. And I realized something that gave me strength every single day. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for everyone who had been told they weren't good enough, for everyone who had been pushed aside, overlooked, and dismissed. I was fighting for the dreamers, the workers, the ones who never gave up. And as long as I had breath in my lungs, I would keep fighting for them. Because I knew one thing for sure. If I could do it, then anyone could.